Hello and welcome to the second proper episode of what we're calling Project Nolan, which I'm sure we'll regret at some point in the future. I am, as always, joined by film studies teacher Matt O'Regan. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Nick.
So today we're talking about a film which was, I believe, it was certainly number 9 on my list. What
Yep.
number did it come in on yours?
It was number 9 as well.
Number 9. So this, like following, we agreed the position of this film.
Yeah.
It's a 2002 movie. So it was his third feature film, second to get a cinema release after Memento, which was a couple of years before. And it shows the kind of meteoric rise of Christopher Nolan, because although his first proper feature film, Memento, had some big stars in it, that they weren't exactly household names at the time, people like Guy Pearce and Carrie-Anne Moss. This film certainly did. This is a movie which has 3 Oscar-winning actors in its 3 lead parts: Al Pacino, Robin Williams, and Hilary Swank, which is interesting because they're 3 Oscar winners from across 3 different generations, essentially. And so this is a huge deal for a studio to sort of address that, to put that sort of money into a movie for someone who's really, it's only their sort of second or third film. But it came in at number 9, and you said you've noticed that it comes in at sort of at the bottom of a lot of these lists where Nolan's films are ranked. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I was looking online at Nolan lists and just sort of seeing how other people view this film in particular, and it always seems to be bottom of the list. Following even appears higher than it in a lot of lists I saw.
Right.
And it's strange because I think if you just look at it on its own, it's probably one of the best crime thrillers, American crime thrillers of the past 20 years. And it shouldn't really be number 9 on any list. That's what I really loved about rewatching it, was finding, remembering how great it was.
That's interesting because we've sort of acknowledged as proper fans of his that putting any of these at the bottom end of the list felt unfair.
Yeah.
And of course, it's also, if people at home have seen the 10 to 6 we've done, it's also thrown up some similarities, but also some that from our own list that seem to be at polar ends of the scale. This is interesting. And I came into this thinking that Insomnia would be near the bottom of my list, and I don't think my initial thoughts made me discriminate against it. It definitely stayed where it was, and we'll get onto that later. But give us a quick synopsis of the movie, and then we'll talk about the stuff that we discussed before about the Nolan traits and so on.
Okay, well, it's a 2002 film, and it is actually a remake of a Norwegian film from 1997 of the same name. So it follows Al Pacino's William Dorman, who's an LA police detective, with his partner Eckhart, who's played by Martin Donovan, and they travel to a town called Nightmute in Alaska because they're investigating the murder of a teenage girl. It's quite a brutal murder, but at the same time, they're also, Eckhart and Dorman are also being investigated by Infernal Affairs, aren't they, for, let's say, sort of dodgy practices in certain cases.
Yeah, it becomes clear that the reason that they've been given this job in a remote part of the state is not necessarily because of their sort of detective prowess, but more that they've been moved away because they're being investigated by Internal Affairs.
Yeah, that's right. They're brought out by Dormer's former detective to sort of clear the way. But what you realise when you get there, linking to the title of the film, is that it's a place where there's perpetual sunlight 24 hours a day.
Yeah, it's kind of must be beyond the Arctic Circle because it's got that weird thing that sort of Scandinavian countries have, don't they?
Yeah, and that sort of plays into the psychology of Dormer, doesn't it? The main character who can't sleep, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later as well. But that also informs like the narrative and the editing I found most of the film, and as the film progresses, it becomes a bit more, or increasingly, disparate, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, it is certainly used as a way of ramping up the tension, doesn't it? I suppose we it's very difficult to kind of to try and avoid spoilers for this film. But I guess something happens in the middle of the film that I won't say, which throws a bit more shade onto Dormer's predicament and how we feel about whether or not he's guilty of the things he's been accused of in the past. I suppose one thing that's a key plot point that isn't really a spoiler based on the kind of marketing is that the chief suspect, if you like, in this crime that they're investigating is played by Robin Williams. And so he's the sort of de facto baddie, as it were, the villain. And which was kind of a little bit of a going against type for Robin Williams, wasn't it? His film career had usually been based along, usually about his kind of larger than life persona, the kind of the sort of Robin Williams character, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think his biggest film or contemporary film around that time was Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yeah, sure.
I think that was what we associated him with. But 2002 was an interesting year for Robin Williams because it was obviously a very conscious effort by himself to sort of shift his image or, open up a new vein in Hollywood, if you like. But he made 3 films that year that all played against type, which were Death to Smoochie, Danny DeVito's Hollywood parody.
Okay, never heard of that. That's mad.
Yeah, it's sort of like a satirical take on a child's TV show, and it sort of exposes, all the dark practices or whatever. And then you've got 1 Hour Photo, which was another crime thriller, where again he plays
the sort of psychopath character, doesn't he?
Yeah, and then Insomnia. And it's in the film as well. He's not really prevalent in the market, but he's introduced quite late in the film, isn't he?
Yes,
the character.
And then, of course,
it's Robin Williams, rather.
The third character in the sort of triumvirate of Oscar winners is Hilary Swank, who plays the kind of young, fresh-faced cop who's working at the station. As straight as they come in terms of not being untouchable in terms of corruption, eager to learn from the best, and is a key part in the sort of investigation and solving the crime.
Yeah, and another function of it I thought was really interesting about her character is I think she is very she asks lots of questions all the time, and she's very on the straight and narrow, isn't she?
Yes.
And she's the moral center of the film, and Dorman in particular sort of swings from either side all the way around her. It's a really interesting relationship.
Despite him being someone who's sort of almost the center of the film, we do often see through her eyes more than his.
Yeah.
Because I guess, okay, we might as well just jump straight into the Nolan traits and stuff, because he again is a kind of unreliable protagonist, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's his actions. I don't mean that we can't trust him, as in we're suspicious of him. We, through what he does and also his experiences, we can't tell whether what we're finding out from him is real or not real, and that mainly comes through his own inability to sleep and his kind of becoming more and more jaded throughout the film. And that unreliable protagonist thing that Nolan does really well, like with Following, it's really clever, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's great, and I think it's very he's building on what he developed in Memento with the character, but in more of a genre setting. Yeah. And you've got the idea that as the film progresses, and the moment you mentioned earlier, the scene that's a spoiler, all the way through when that event happens, I think I at least the first time I watched it just believed what he said, and then as the film progresses, you start to question that as he does. And I think this idea of insomnia, and very similar to Memento as well, is that the character starts to operate in between dream or in between being awake and asleep, and in a dream state.
Why is it so powerful to take a protagonist and make them untrustworthy or make the audience have doubts about? Why is that such a powerful tool for filmmakers? And it's when it's so rarely used. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's more relatable for audiences, and I don't know if this is an effect of developing our media understanding or becoming more sophisticated. But old Hollywood, they didn't have characters like that. It was very it was binary oppositions, good and evil, and as from the 70s onwards, characters have become more complex. So I think it's a bit as the world changes and we become more sophisticated spectators, that we start to find these characters more engaging because they are more realistic. And our memory is, you say in Memento, don't they? Our memory, we can't trust it.
Yeah.
And we now can't trust the memory of the characters on screen. So.
Is there something particularly good or useful about using that in a thriller, because it adds to that unsettling feeling? that disjointed, or there's something just not quite right if you can't trust the person you're living in the world with.
Oh yeah, I mean, because then every alley or every sort of corner or alley the narrative goes down, there's a question mark at the end of it, isn't there?
Yeah.
And as that's built throughout the film, it increases tension and suspense, and it's just very effective.
Because there should be a little bell goes off every time I mention Hitchcock, but like thinking of Hitchcock making thrillers, and in particular Psycho, where of course we're forced to identify with the character throughout the first half of the movie, only to have them ripped away from us. That's incredibly isolating for an audience. And so when Dormer does something, when the plot point happens to Dormer in the middle of the film, suddenly we're kind of taken away from him. So everything we thought we knew suddenly becomes a little bit thrown in the air. So it's can be quite alienating for an audience, can't it?
Yeah, I think that's prevalent throughout all of Nolan's work, that theme of isolation in particular. I think in our last video, I mentioned the quote where Nolan says he likes to put the audience behind the character in the narrative, not as like a passive spectator. I think we are that in Insomnia, and that moment when we realize we can't trust the character. It just becomes a lot more interesting and engaging for the audience.
What's interesting as well is another device that is used to try and get us inside Dormer's mind is the use of flashbacks, and we're never quite sure whether they're part of Dormer's imagination or whether there's something that happened that's real. Again, that kind of throws a bit of shade onto his reliability. He's another character as well that doesn't seem to play by the rules, as it were, or certainly we see him as someone upstanding and moral, and yet we get the sense that maybe he doesn't always play by the rules, which again linked into that kind of following Cobb thing and people breaking their own set of rules. Is morality a key theme of the film?
Oh yeah, definitely. And that you're right, that I think Pacino generally sees or tries to justify what he's done as he's done the right thing, hasn't he? The ends justify the means. And what's interesting with this film, I think, is that the Robin Williams character does the same, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He claims that the act is an accident, and then they both sort of get entangled in this web where they're trying to convince each other and convince themselves that they're morally right in what they've done.
There's quite a bit of foreshadowing going on here with these other movies. If you're thinking about characters that they're sort of two sides of the same coin, the same justification, one for moral good, one for something bad, then you're looking at pretty much every Batman baddie. Batman is the reverse side of Bane, of the Joker, of and so on. There was another connection I saw this. It took me completely by surprise to The Dark Knight, and without giving too much away, but that idea that if Will Dormer's is taken on by internal affairs, if they find something in his past, that will destroy his reputation, which is definitely a theme that runs throughout The Dark Knight, doesn't it? That kind of idea of discrediting a hero.
Yeah, and it's also what motivates Cobb, isn't it, in Inception?
Yeah,
is to clear his name. He's been at the same experience. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
And with Cobb, I hadn't even made that connection as well. So it's it's interesting one, that, isn't it, for Dormer? What's mad about Dormer is just the fact that the word Dormer means sleep.
Oh really? Didn't know that.
When Nolan throws in those little things, because he seems to be kind of obsessed with names in a sort of literary way, but it's sort of, in a way, it's not necessary. The film's good enough without those little clues, as it were. Okay, what about the style then of the movie? How does that sort of chime with the rest of Nolan's canon?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why it's maybe on number 9. Because I was thinking it's quite similar to, I was thinking about Stanley Kubrick and the way people talk about his films and they rate his films. And, Spartacus is one of the most famous films ever. And I had a look online and it's generally quite low down on his list, but it's considered a classic. No, I wouldn't put Spartacus near the top of my list. And I was wondering, is that because is that just on the technical merits or the merits of the film, or is it because it's not what you'd call a Kubrick film? And I don't think Insomnia is the least Nolan film, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think in the age now of the auteur in particular, we focus so much on the personal style, anything that deviates from it we sort of maybe see it outside of the
Do
body
you
of
know
work.
this,
You know what I mean?
if this, I mean, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but I agree with you, and I think actually the reason why it's my number 9, I would go as far as saying I would even say it's slightly derivative. I think that some of some of it feels very much like a Silence of the Lambs, and it does, it obviously owes a debt to Silence of the Lambs, and I think it, why I probably prefer it is that the villain isn't the kind of psychopathic freak show type idea, and I think that actually lets Silence of the Lambs down a bit, but he's a much more sort of normal guy, so that he can be the flip side of Will Dormer's character. But it did feel a lot like Silence of the Lambs, and quite a lot of 90s thrillers it felt very influenced by. And that's why I think possibly, like you just said, it's the least Nolan of them.
Yeah. I still found there was a lot of quite, thinking about it again and watching scenes and bits and pieces again, and I haven't watched the film recently again. It was there was more Nolan elements than I would have expected, to be honest. And I don't think in terms of necessarily style, but in terms of like narrative and character.
Sure.
But coming back to your point, I mean, we've talked about this off air. I don't think this really happens anymore. Maybe that's a detriment to Hollywood, but this film is a test for Nolan, and everything about it screams that. It's a genre film. It's a mid-budget. It's got stars. It's on location. And he was basically given it before Batman. He was given this job, wasn't he? Saying, if you can bring this in under budget, handle stars, make a profit, you've got Batman.
Yeah.
And the film feels very much like that. I think it's missing that personal touch, even though I really love it as a genre film.
Yeah, because that genre film element takes away from the things that I actually fell in love with about Memento. The kind of Memento's narrative sort of cleverness, for want of a better word. That sort. And I know it's a sort of a gimmick or a trick, but I love that. I think it works brilliantly. And apart from the odd twist or turn, it doesn't have that same narrative intrigue as Memento did.
No.
And I wanted more of that, but didn't necessarily get it. Are there any Nolan hints though? Do we get? Would a real aficionado be able to pick out small parts?
I think so. I think he has a certain, Ote has always come back to signature shots. The big example people always give is Tarantino as a trunk shot.
Yeah.
Well, Tarantino's trunk. I mean, Nolan's trunk shot is the close up or the motif or the cut in, and he has these motifs that he has close cut ins, and they usually appear at the start of the film, but they also bookend the narrative at the end. So an item may appear insignificant, but it becomes significant at the end, often revealing the clue of the film, like the Polaroid in Memento.
Okay.
And as well, I noticed at the start, do we start Insomnia with the flashback, I think, through the window, and it's sort of a distorted view of Dormer laying evidence.
Actually, the opening shot is of a mirror, and in my notes, I made a note of that because, of course, in Memento, there's quite a famous shot with a mirror where revealing Guy Pearce's tattoos.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder if this will be significant as I go through. I didn't make any more notes on mirrors throughout, but it did feel those opening scenes do feel quite Nolan-esque. The flashback again. I think I mentioned it for following. The flashback is usually in handheld in his movies. All of Bruce Wayne's little flashbacks and stuff in Memento. That did feel quite similar.
And even just the shot of Dormer through, it was near the start through the window, and I think it's when he's planting the evidence. It seems maybe not that relevant or not significant at the start, but it's the missing piece of the puzzle at the end.
Yeah,
and he always comes back to something like that. So I think little bits and pieces like that are there, and I think you can tell it's not just a job and director, because it could have been, even, as you said, even more derivative, but the changes to the characters and a few bits and pieces made it, I found, a lot more compelling.
Yeah, definitely, and that sort of the cat and mouse game that it turns into is great. I mean, that again is a well-trodden cliche or trope, but when you've got Pacino and someone like Robin Williams, who's incredibly versatile, it's great. And in particular, one actual cat and mouse, one chase scene, is amongst the most tense sequences you'll you'll ever watch, isn't it? It's really
great.
quite, you hold your breath, literally, not just like it takes your breath away. You will hold your breath when watching it because the character has to, and it's I don't want to give too much away, but it's fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah.
The one Nolan thing that, again, a little bit of foreshadowing because it's a move away from Memento and Following, is, I don't know, was Wally Pfister cinematographer on this? Was his first work with him?
I don't know, to be honest.
Because I know we mentioned with Following, it's very claustrophobic, but this is the first time that Nolan can get out into big, wide, open vistas.
Yeah,
particularly with
it is Wally Pfister.
It's Wally. So those, I mean, he shoots landscapes in a way like Roger Deakins does, doesn't he? You know, they're so beautiful, and there's, you know, he looks for the perfectly composed shot, and it reminded me of those sweeping shots of the sort of tundra in Batman Begins, and even in Dark Knight Rises and stuff like that. And it's lovely, isn't it? The photography on this.
I think that also plays into, you know, it feels, you said it felt like Silence of the Lambs. It's got a very Fargo feel in that sense, a lot of wide shots of desolate landscapes. But it's interesting because I thought that watching it was a very close film, but I think at the end, you've got Hilary Swank's character. She's racing to a cabin where Robin Williams is. He's constantly cutting between the claustrophobic, tight environment and massive landscape, and you could almost feel, you know, that sense of scale wanting to burst out at the end of the film that we start to see. I don't think we see it till Inception, but you know.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, because that intercutting with sort of claustrophobia and almost agoraphobia, I suppose, again happens in a scene where another chase sequence where they're out in the, you know, the big wide open, but suddenly it gets really foggy and they can't see more than 2 foot in front of them. Again, it's a brilliant sort of little device of turning what you thought was the big wide open into something very claustrophobic. Well, we haven't, sound doesn't kick in just yet in terms of our discussion with Nolan, because there's nothing, the score's not really anything to speak of, is it?
No. And I think, you know, again, it's to this point we made earlier about what we expect from Nolan. You know, it's almost like it's not Nolan if it's not Zimmer as well.
Yeah.
Like that's what we expect. So
interestingly, I think this one is composed by the guy who was maybe one of his sort of friends from the early days of filmmaking. So there is that continuity of crew there.
Yeah.
But it's certainly worth a watch, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, definitely.
Like I said, it's some points it's genuinely very, very tense.
Yeah, and I think it's placed as number 9. Come back to what I said at the start. It's not an indication of what I think about the film in isolation. We're talking about our ranking of Nolan films, aren't we?
Yeah.
And when I think of a Nolan film, you know, you think of the spectacle and the mad ideas and all that type of stuff. And this film is great, but it's not high. It's not like a great Nolan film.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah, definitely. That's Insomnia 2002. It's got, I mean, it's worth seeing if you like the thriller genre, or if you're a fan of any of the 3 main cast members, I'd say.
So it's Pacino's last great role.
Yeah.
Until maybe The Irishman.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. And it's one of the few roles where he's really restrained and quite subtle. I think he's well, all in all, but he's spectacular.
There's a scene on the phone where he takes a phone call, and you get, it must be like a big close up of him to really, and I've seen Nolan talk about that to really get him sort of that feel like we're intimately involved in the phone call, and it works brilliantly.
Pacino saying it was surprised how close the camera was, and then Pacino saying, you know, that's sort of when he realised, I think, this guy was onto something.
It was an era where Pacino used to shout his way through movies, Any Given Sunday, or what was the one he made with Russell Crowe? I actually really like this film. But was The
Insider?
Yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Even Heat, you know.
Yeah.
You're walking your doggy.
He does. It is a really restrained performance, isn't it? And a very creepy one from Robin Williams as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, in retrospect, now everything that happened with Robin Williams, to see him like that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
It's great.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I have returned to it. Obviously, it's one that I've watched more than once. So it's, you know, it's got. And I think watching a second time, you'll look for other things. So maybe that's the Nolan-esque aspect of it.
Yeah.
Is that it does make you watch it again, looking for new stuff.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for that. We'll be back. I think our next video we're going to talk about Memento, which wasn't in my 10 to 6. It was in yours, but I'll explain why we're going to do that when we do the next one. So until next time, I'll see you again, Matt.
That's it.
I'll see everyone at home. Cheerio. Bye-bye.